Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to St. Mary's College on this winter night. Thank you for coming out. This is a lovely crowd and we're happy to have you. My name is Arlene Montevecchio. I'm the director of the Center for Spirituality here at the college, which was founded in 1984 with generous support from the Sisters of the Holy Cross, who continue to animate our mission today. Our 2020 Endowed Spring Lecture Series is focused on religion and literature, and it's my great privilege to welcome back to campus Dr. M. Shawn Copeland, Professor Emerita of Boston College. Dr. Copeland was our 2007 Mataliva lecturer. Her career has spanned 35 years with 17 at Boston College, and it has been nothing short of distinguished. Her book, Enfleshing Freedom, Body, Race, and Being, has been called a modern theological classic. She is also the author of Knowing Christ Crucified, The Witness of African American Religious Experience, The Subversive Power of Love, The Vision of Henriette DeLille, and co-editor of 4 theological volumes. In addition, she's published more than 125 articles, book chapters, and reviews. Last year, the Catholic Theological Society of America presented Professor Copeland with its highest honor, the John Courtney Murray Award. She has also been honored with the Marianist Award, the Eve Conger Award, and the Elizabeth Ann Seton Award. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shawn Copeland.
So good evening, and thank you so much for being here. And I'm grateful to faculty who are able to be here. I know that this is still early days in the semester, but it's still also still hectic. And there's also admissions processes and hiring processes that are at stake. So I'm very grateful that people could find the time to be here. I'm also grateful for some interesting surprises of people's presence that I didn't quite expect. So that's really quite nice to reconnect. I want to thank the Center for Spirituality, Ms. Arlene Montevecchio and Ms. Kathleen Guthrie for all their efforts to make this such a pleasant and seamless activity for me, arriving and staying and eating, feasting. And I'd like to thank really Professor Jessica Koblenz from St. Mary's College for collaborating with the center in the luncheon that we had today for graduate students and undergrads. Finally, let me say that as a Catholic woman theologian, it is always a distinctive honor to speak at St. Mary's College, since this is the place where Mataliva Wolf made it possible for women to do theology. So I'm very grateful, again, to be here. Well, first of all, let me say that I really have shifted my title a little bit towards spirituality. I'll still talk about sacramentals and memory and communion, but I think this broader umbrella will be very useful for us. So spirituality in Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon. Fine writers, womanist ethicist Emily Towns declares, quote, helps us see things in tangible ways and feel things through intangible means. Their ability to turn the world to a tilt, to explore our humanity and inhumanity challenges, close quote. Unquestionably, the late Nobel Laureate Toni Morrison is such a writer. In Song of Solomon, she blends elements of African traditional religion, of African American history and folklore, and of Catholicism in order to turn our world at a startling tilt. Critics write appreciatively of this intricate religio-cultural melange in Song of Solomon, But typically, they link the characters, especially Macon Dead III, also known as Milkman, and his aunt, Pilate Dead, Pilate, Pilate Dead. They link them to quest figures, or to failed rites of passage, or to Greek mythology. Few critics explore connections between Song of Solomon and Christianity. Even fewer consider the novel's relation to themes or elements of Catholic spirituality. In this lecture, I want to do just this. Consider how spirituality, memory, sacramentals, and communion, themes and symbols with especial Catholic resonance, figure in the novel. 3 parts comprise this presentation. The first briefly sets out the structure of the novel, calling attention to literary devices, chronology, geography, and references to historical events and persons. And I want to also give you the main characters in the novel. There are a lot of people that I'm not going to talk about, but perhaps maybe mention, but they're there. Song of Solomon really is a psychological novel. It's much more concerned with an examination of the inner lives of its characters and their responses to historical and familiar circumstances than it is with action. Hence, the second part will sketch the relationships between some of the characters and their efforts to resolve frictions between and among themselves and to wrestle with their inner tensions. The third part focuses on spirituality, offering a kind of Catholic theological reading by attending to memory, sacramentals, and communion. Now, by way of prologue, let me set out a kind of apologia, an account of guiding principles for the critical reading or interpretation that follows. Quite frankly, I want to ward off any suspicions that may lurk among professors and students of English and American literatures. Professors and students who may be concerned about theologians instrumentalizing or distorting fiction. The philosopher of aesthetics, Theodor Adorno, reminds us that, quote, art may be the only remaining medium of truth in an age of incomprehensible terror and suffering, close quote. Literature teaches and tutors us, coaxes and coaches us, all of us, even theologians, in the mysteries of the human mind and human heart. My intention is neither to probe every passage in search of the supernatural, nor to shove the novel into doctrinal suppositions. Well-written, demanding novels challenge. They resist reduction both to naive literalism and overblown symbolizing. Theology and literature draw our attention to what is vital and important, turn us toward what is transcendent, toward what transcends us, toward the potentialities of our own self-transcendence. In an act of sublation, literature and theology gather us and move us to other and deeper densities of experience and thought, of understanding and judgment, of pleasure and beauty, of terror and awe. The intensity of encounter with literature requires the theologian, indeed any interpreter, to proceed with humble respect for the act of literary creation, to meet the work with courtesy and sensitivity to the writer's language, to inhabit patience and sympathy in reading, and in the words of literary critic Derek Attridge, quote, to read creatively in an attempt to respond fully and responsibly to the alterity and singularity of the text, close quote. The theologian must work against the mind's tendency to assimilate the other to the same, and finally, move with great delicacy and daring in creative interpretation. So again, the novel will be, what I'm going to say will be a little bit more familiar to you if I can give you a list of the main characters, just as a quick reference, not anything detailed here. But our main character, we're going to meet these people in order of appearance. Macon Dead III, who is also known as Milkman, who is the central male character, as Pilate Dead is the central female character. Jake, who is the first Macon Dead. Circe, the midwife, who assists at the births of Macon Jr. and Pilate, and will later help Milkman. Reba, who is Pilate's daughter. Reba's daughter, Hagar, Pilate's granddaughter. Macon Dad Jr., who is the brother to Pilate, married to Ruth, father of two daughters, Magdalena or Lena, 1 Corinthians, and Milkman. The other characters are Mr. Robert Smith, we'll meet him actually first, and then Guitar Baines, who is Milkman's best friend, Reverend Cooper, who will tell Milkman about his family, and Miss Susan Bird, who helps him figure out his genealogical puzzle. I'm going to leave here this chart just so you have some idea of how these characters are interrelated, the ones that I'm going to speak about most. Song of Solomon is a complex, open-ended, paradoxical novel crafted within an Afrocentric horizon in which storytelling or narrative has never been merely entertainment. The novel opens in media res, that is, in the middle of things, and gradually the omniscient narrator fills us in through literary devices such as flashbacks, the recreation of dialogue, exposition of the innermost thoughts and motivations of the characters, and reconstructions of past events. Chronologically or temporally, the novel covers nearly a century. 3 generations of a black family, enslaved, then emancipated. We learn their history through the gradual disclosure of fragments of memory and legend, folk songs and children's games, folk beliefs, rituals, historical events. These all coalesce into a past. In Song of Solomon, Morrison creates a cosmology redolent of the worldview of the Bakongo peoples, whose ancient kingdom included parts of present-day Angola, Gabon, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Congo-Brazzaville, or the Congo Republic. From this rich culture comes the central powerful and empowering metaphor of flying, which opens and closes the novel. This particular African people, then, are said to have possessed the power of physical flight. In Song of Solomon, Morrison also builds a detailed historical scaffolding, not only traces the destiny of the descendants of Solomon, the flying African, but also to place their lives within documented historical events and persons: the First World War, Prohibition, the Depression, the death of Emmett Till, Jim Crow, movements for civil rights, Father Divine, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and John Fitzgerald Kennedy. This historical context stands as a reminder of the consequences of living as the characters do, with little awareness of the historical forces affecting their lives. So part 2, a sketch of some of the main characters, their relationships and tensions. As I stated earlier, Song of Solomon begins in media res, in the middle of things, quite precisely Wednesday, the 18th of February, 1931. Mr. Robert Smith, the black North Carolina Mutual life insurance agent, has promised to fly from the top of Mercy Hospital to the other side of Lake Superior at 3 p.m. By 11 o'clock in the morning, 40 or 50 people, nearly all black, have gathered to watch. The crowd mills about, uncertain, perhaps daydreaming, until a woman bursts into song. This is our introduction to the novel's central female character, Pilot Dead. She wears a knitted navy cap, pulled far down over her forehead, and is wrapped in an old quilt rather than a winter coat. Her head cocked to one side, her eyes fixed on Mr. Smith, she sang in a powerful contralto, "Oh, sugar man, don't fly away. Sugar man done gone. Sugar man cut across the sky. Sugar man gone home." Also standing among the crowd is Ruth Foster Dead, well-dressed in a neat gray coat, a black cloche, and a pair of 4-button ladies' galoshes. Ruth is married to prosperous black property owner and landlord Macon Dead Jr., Pilate's brother. The shock of Mr. Smith's attempt to fly on his own wings causes Ruth to go into labor. The next day, the novel's central male character, Macon Dead III, also known as Milkman, is born in what previously was the all-white Mercy Hospital. If Pilate sings to comfort the crowd, perhaps even to explain the insurance agent's actions, the song is the thread that the adult milkman must find, will follow. He will scale rough physical, relational, and spiritual terrain to find himself, to find wholeness. Rather quickly, the narrator moves us backward, relating the origin of the peculiar surname Dead. Following the end of the Civil War and emancipation, a young black man, Jake, arrives to register at the Virginia office of the Freedmen's Bureau. When Jake replies to the questions he is asked, he says that he is from Macon, Virginia, and that his family is dead. The Union soldier charged with recording this information is unfocused, half-listening, and drunk, and so scrawls in perfect thoughtlessness, Morrison writes, Jake's name as Macon Dead. Jake is the first Macon Dead. He passes this name on to his first son, Macon Dead Jr., who in turn passes the name on to his firstborn son, Macon Dead III. The first Macon names his daughter by opening the Bible at random and putting his finger on a word. When he performs this ritual, the first Macon is soaked in angry grief. His wife, Rena, has died giving birth to the infant girl. Unable to read, Macon carefully copies the letters on a slip of paper that he hands to the midwife, Circe. She promptly shouts that he cannot name his daughter Pilate. Like a riverboat pilot, Macon asks? No, not like no riverboat pilot. Like a Christ killer pilot. You can't get much worse than that for a name, and a baby girl at that. That's where my finger went down at. Well, your brain ain't got to follow it. You don't want to give this motherless child the name of the man that killed Jesus, do you? I asked Jesus to save my wife. Careful, Macon. I asked him all night long. He give you your baby? Yes, he did. Baby named Pilate. Jesus, have mercy. Where are you going with that piece of paper? It's going back where it came from, right in the devil's flames. Give it here. It comes from the Bible. It stays in the Bible. And it stayed there, the narrator tells us, until the baby girl turned 12 and took it out, folded it up into a tiny knot, and put it in a little brass box and strung the entire contraption through her left earlobe. The first Macon was clever, industrious, and successful. After 16 years of backbreaking labor, he had one of the best farms in Montour County, Pennsylvania. But the wealthy white men, gentlemen farmers of the Butler family, resented, even envied, this black man's progress. They killed him for his property. Fearful, Macon Jr., 16, and Pilate, 12, bury their father in a shallow, rock-covered grave, then take refuge with the midwife, Circe. After 2 weeks, the siblings leave her protection and seek shelter in a cave not far away. When an old white man stumbles upon the pair, Macon, nervous and afraid, kills him. Not too long afterward, the siblings stumble across sacks of gold nuggets in the cave. Macon wants to take it. Pilate, thinking it wrong, does not. They argue, come to blows, then part company. 3 days after their fight, Macon Jr. returned to the cave to recover the gold, but the sacks are gone. He assumes that Pilate has taken them. Macon Jr. leaves and will not see his sister again for nearly 50 years. When the siblings finally meet, Pilate acknowledges that she did return to the cave, but 7 or 8 years later, and only at the bidding of the spirit of their deceased father to collect the bones of the murdered man. After the fight with her brother, Pilate becomes a wanderer. This is a Google map. I didn't draw it, and I want to give credit to Google for giving us this map. So Pilate becomes a wanderer. For nearly 4 years, she zigzags her way from Pennsylvania to Virginia to West Virginia to upstate New York, back to Virginia, which is the family's ancestral North American home. Along the way, she joins migrant workers picking crops or finds work in laundries. All the while, she carries a geography book and a souvenir, rocks, one collected from each place to which she traveled. When she reaches Culpeper, Virginia, Pilate takes work washing laundry in a hotel. In town, she hears talk of 25 or 30 black families who live on an island off the coast. She pays the then extravagant sum of a nickel for passage across the mainland. After 3 months of hard but recreative outdoor labor, Pilate takes a common-law husband, and roughly a year later gives birth to a daughter, Reba. So I'll go back to the chart just so you can keep up here. The narrator explains that in the thick fog of depression and loneliness following Reba's birth, the spirit of her father came to Pilate and admonished, "Sing, sing." And then again he said, "You just can't fly off and leave a body." Pilate took this to mean that she should sing, and she did, and that she should return to the Pennsylvania cave to collect what was left of the man murdered so many years ago. When Reba turns 2, Pilate surrendered again to restlessness and struck out to wander. This is about 1913 now. The two of them moved around until Reba was 16 or 18. Then Pilate settled them in the colored section of a small, unnamed town and began to work as a bootlegger. Not long after, Reba gives birth to a daughter whom she names Hagar. When Hagar is of school age, Pilate determines that her granddaughter, quote, needed family, people, a life very different from what she and Reba could offer, close quote. She searches for and finds her brother Macon Jr. In 1930, a year or so prior to Milkman's birth, Pilate, her daughter Reba, and granddaughter Hagar take the train to an unnamed town in Michigan where her brother and his family live. Pilate found her brother Macon Jr. conventional and embarrassed at her manner of dress and decorum. He had become prosperous and a rather pitiless landlord, belligerent and vindictive. Macon Jr. is contemptuous of his wife Ruth, disdainful of his daughters Magdalene and 1 Corinthians, suspicious and hostile toward his son Milkman. If the brother has grown mean, selfish, and grasping, fixed on money and acquiring property, the sister is quite the opposite. Pilate is a natural healer, a root worker, or herbalist. Her experiences of rejection have ripened into deep compassion for troubled people, generous hospitality, gentleness with animals, familiarity with and love of the earth, and deep concern for and about human relationships. Macon Jr. receives his sister grudgingly, annoyed and exasperated, but he remembers the gold and surprisingly assumes that Pilate still has it. We are introduced to Milkman even before he is born. He is the first black baby born inside Mercy Hospital. As a boy, Milkman was mesmerized by his Aunt Pilate, alternately shy and sullen, genial and eager for her attention. As a young adult, he is sexually attracted to Hagar, his emotionally fragile second cousin, and begins an intense but careless sexual relationship with her. Self-absorbed and spoiled, after some years, Milkman, now about 32, tires of Hagar, discards her for another woman, and abandons her to emotional breakdown. To avoid her ongoing attention, Milkman decides to leave town for a year or two and asks his father to finance his escape. Macon Jr. tells him about the gold from the cave. The father convinces the son that it is hidden in Pilate's house. Stealing it would fund Milkman's getaway and augment his own finances. Milkman imagines that the gold is stored in an old moss-green sack suspended from the ceiling in Pilate's house. After all, Hagar once told him that Pilate calls the bag her inheritance. Milkman and his best friend Guitar Baines steal the bag, but it contains only rocks and human bones. Angry at coming up empty, they decide the gold must still be in the cave. Milkman resolves to find it and promises a share to Guitar, who plans to use the money to fund a secret society that avenges injustices perpetrated against African Americans. But Milkman wants to make the journey alone, without his friend. Milkman travels by plane, train, bus, and automobile, first to Virginia, then to Pennsylvania. Like a detective, he asked questions of all the people he met, looked for clues to the puzzle of his family. For days, he marveled as old men relived their youth, recalling their admiration for his grandfather. Listened intently as Reverend Cooper, Circe, and Susan Bird recalled memories of his great-grandfather, his grandfather, his father, and aunt. Circe tells Milkman that the first Macon's original name was Jake, and that he was married to an Indian woman whose name was Singh. These fragments of memories stretch Milkman. He wrestles with them, but the whole eludes him. On his last day in Shalimar, which is located in Virginia, at 6:30 in the morning, Milkman waits for the repairs to his car to be completed. Restless, he walks around as the little town bustles with activity. The children are playing round games. Milkman is drawn to their singing and leans against a cedar tree to listen and to watch. And then they begin a familiar song, one he had heard off and on all his life, the old blues song Pilate sang, "Oh, Sugar Man, Don't Leave Me." Except the children are singing, "Solomon, Don't Leave Me Here." Milkman listens more intently, and he recognizes that the children are singing about his ancestors, about his family. Jake, the only son of Solomon, cum bubayale, cum bubatambe, whirled about and touched the sun, cum kankayale, cum kankatambe, left that baby in a white man's house, cum bubayale, cum bubatambe. Hetty took him to a red man's house. Come kunkayale, come kankatambe. Black lady fell down on the ground. Come bubayale, come bubatanke. Threw her body all around. Come kankayale, come kankatambe. Solomon and Rena, Belai Shalut, Yarabu, Medina, Mahut too, Nestor Kalina, Sarah Cake, 21 children, the last one, Jake. Oh, Solomon, don't leave me here. Cotton balls to choke me. Oh, Solomon, don't leave me here. Buckra's arms to yoke me. Solomon done fly. Solomon done gone. Solomon cut across the sky. Solomon gone home. Clutching the words to the round, Milkman returns to Susan Bird. She helps him sort and rearrange the pieces of his genealogical puzzle. One day, his enslaved paternal great-grandparents, Solomon and Rena, were working in a cotton field. Suddenly, Solomon threw down the hoe, ran up a hill, spun around, and flew off into the air back to Africa, escaping slavery. Although he gains freedom, Solomon's flight wounds the family. He left behind his wife, Rena, who in anguish goes insane, and their 21 male children. Solomon tried to take the infant Jake with him, but the infant slipped from his grasp. Hetty, perhaps an Algonquin woman, finds and raises Jake, who as a young man marries her daughter, Sing. Once Milkman grasps that the children's song is about Solomon, the song of Solomon, he is fundamentally and profoundly changed. What began as a material quest evolved into a spiritual journey. Milkman has found a treasure far more precious than gold. He has found his family's history in fact and in feeling. The people of Shalimar, Virginia, have given him a powerful and empowering spiritual gift, the key to his past, his identity, his wholeness. But after surviving an assassination attempt by Guitar, who has been trailing him, Milkman returns home to Michigan with a startling story. He and Pilate return to Shalimar, where they bury Jake's bones on Solomon's Leap, the mountain from which Solomon flew back to Africa. After burying the bones, Pilate is struck dead by a bullet that Guitar had intended for Milkman. Shattered and heartbroken at Pilate's death, Milkman calls out Guitar's name and leaps toward him. So here's our song, huh? It's a comparison. So spirituality in Song of Solomon. Some of you may find the notion of spirituality in relation to Song of Solomon surprising, and others may think linking the novel to Catholicism or Catholic spirituality to be dubious or odd or perhaps flat out wrong. On the one hand, Catholicism in the United States presents itself overwhelmingly as the faith of European immigrants, thus separate from or exterior to African American experience. On the other hand, literary critic Aaron Salius suggests that when we look closely, quote, Catholicism appears at the margins of a significant number of significant works throughout the canon of African American literature, close quote. So in this third part, I want to try to explore the appearance of some features of Catholicism in Song of Solomon. And my purpose is to open space for our appreciation of the protean spiritual potential of aesthetic creation. Spirituality in Song of Solomon. What do I mean by spirituality? Most basically, I understand spirituality as a way of life, a way of living, a way of being in and moving with and through the world. This shorthand definition coincides with that advanced by biblical exegete Sandra Schneiders. Spirituality, according to Schneiders, is, quote, a relatively developed relationality to self, others, world, and the transcendent. And she writes with a capital T, whether called God or designated by some other term, close quote. Catholicism is, of course, a religion. Yet to put it radically, Catholicism is a spirituality. In other words, first and foremost, Catholicism is a way of living. It is a way of life, a way of being in and moving with and through the world. Thus, as a way of life, a way of living, it enfleshes and sacralizes memory and word, mystery, sacrament, and materiality, sacramentals, community, and communion. Moreover, this way of life and living extends the Word made flesh through community and communion in and through and beyond time. Some of the chief features of Catholic spirituality include a focus on Jesus of Nazareth and his mother, the incorporation of material objects in devotional life, concrete expression of the principle of both and, not either or, both and, both grace and freedom, both faith and reason, both order and charismatica, both tradition and innovation, and the prioritizing of memory, community, sacramentals, and communion. To quote Schneiders again, spirituality, quote, denotes experience, personal lived reality which has both active and passive dimensions. It is an expression of conscious involvement in a project of life integration, pursued toward self-transcendence, toward ultimate value, close quote. The way in which Pilate dead lives her life, the way she is, the way in which she moves in and with and through the world, discloses a developed and developing relationality to self, others, the world, and the transcendent, small t. Developed and developing, because human living always is fragile praxis, infleshing vulnerabilities and virtues, judgments and decisions, surrender and discipline, atonement and conversion. To be sure, the very name Pilate is problematic, but perhaps the first Macon dead, in his interchange with Circe, presciently grasps the irony of his girl child's name. Pilot Dead will turn out to be a strong and certain healer, not a weak and equivocating executioner. Pilot Dead is a riverboat pilot. She perceptively and indirectly, rather than ham-fistedly or didactically, guides her family as they traverse the shoals of the river of life, navigate reckonings with moral and psychic challenges. Like a riverboat pilot, pilot's experience of moving with and through nature has resulted in much practical and useful knowledge. Her talent as a healer has been augmented by this training as a skilled root worker or herbalist, and she has gained valuable moral and social insight through her varied interactions with others. Because early in her life, Pilot was blunt, would not suffer fools, because she displayed little, if any, patience for condescending behavior and gossip, malicious gossip, she was driven repeatedly from the warmth of human companionship and community. This may account in part for her wandering. But at some point, she makes a decision regarding her own life integration. She throws away, quote, every assumption she had learned and began at zero. Then, continuing the quote, tackled the problem of trying to decide how she wanted to live and what was valuable to her. When am I happy and when am I sad? And what is the difference? What do I know? What do I need to know to stay alive? What is true in the world? Throughout this fresh, if common pursuit of knowledge, one conviction crowned her efforts. Since death held no terrors for her, she often spoke to the dead. She knew there was nothing to fear, close quote. Always, Pilot is respectful and polite to everyone she meets and offers hospitality, food, and conversation to visitors. Always, she is gentle with animals. Making wine and cooking whiskey not only stabilized her, but allowed her to root herself in a place and gave her freedom to sacralize or sanctify her time, hour by hour, day by day. Pilot seemed to lack a fixed schedule. Rather, she lived according to nature's horarium, or daily schedule. Pilot lived on her own terms, measuring her choices by the extent to which they assist her in achieving her humanity and in orienting her towards self-transcendence. Pilot introduces us to sacramentals. In particular, she introduces us to reliquaries, containers for precious or sacred objects. More generally, sacramentals remind us of and orient us toward transcendence, toward the transcendent. Such signs include physical objects. You know them: candles, rosaries, medals, relics, statues, and reliquaries. Music, instrumental and sung. Gestures, making the sign of the cross, or processions, or dancing. Prayers, novenas, or litanies. Dangling from Pilot's ear is a tiny brass box that had belonged to her deceased mother. It was her mother's snuff box. It contained the slip of paper on which her father had laboriously written her name. Wearing the earring honors, venerates, and memorializes her parents, the mother whom she never knew, and the slip of paper bearing the ambiguous gift of her name. The moss green sack suspended from the ceiling of her house also functions as a sacramental, a reliquary. After retrieving the bones, Pilot takes them in her souvenir rocks wherever she travels. Perhaps we might read the retrieval, preservation, and protection of the bones as an act of atonement. Pilot did not kill the man in the cave, but she took responsibility for the murder. She and her brother, Macon Jr., were a unit. The orphan brother and sister were one. At the conclusion of the novel, we learn that the sack, in fact, holds the bones of their father, Jake, the first Macon dead. His shallow, rock-covered grave flooded. His body floated up, and someone left it, put his remains in the cave. The spirit of the first Macon dead appeared to his daughter so that she might bury him properly. If Pilot is a riverboat pilot, she is also a harbor. She is a grace and gift. She gives refuge to those who need a home. When her nephew, Milkman, and his friend Guitar visit her house for the first time, they enter into a sacred space conjured through memory and sacramentals. Milkman is swept up into a near trance by the incantatory sound of Pilot's voice as she tells stories about his father and grandfather, by the way she pronounces words, by the smells of winemaking, and by the effect of strong sunlight streaming through uncovered windows. The narrator tells us that this visit was the first time in her life that Milkman, the first time in his life that Milkman, remembered being completely happy, close quote. In this setting, Milkman receives, and Pilot offers and celebrates communion, nourishing her nephew and his friend and her family spiritually with fragments of family stories, and nourishing them existentially with joyous and companionable acceptance, with communion and community. Pilot's memories not only evoke and hand-on knowledge of the past, but recreate the present and create conditions for the possibility of a future different from her own and that of her brother. If we think of the biblical verse here from the Song of Solomon, which we all remember, this wonderful verse placed me like a seal upon your heart. The ancestors are to be sealed on the heart. This is one lesson from this novel. Singing of Solomon teaches their names, keeps their memory alive, and seals them on the heart. I want to conclude so we'll have ample time for conversations or questions about the novel. But let me say, like the African griots of old, Toni Morrison is an oral weaver. And like the best folk tale or dilemma story, Song of Solomon is indirectly didactic. The characters of the novel illustrate what it means to value family, venerate ancestors, cherish children and old people, honor friendship, and treat with courtesy and respect all those encountered along the way. Song of Solomon also illustrates just how dangerous it is to be found at crossroads, dangerous and decisive moments in life, to be found at those dangerous and decisive moments without the healing and protective knowledge of one's history, people, and family, of one's purpose and direction. Finally, a great novel, literary critic Ron Davidson tells us, quote, is not a list of facts that someone can explain to you. A great novel is an experience, aesthetic or spiritual or both, that can be known directly, one-on-one, close quote. I hope that you will read Song of Solomon, and I hope you will read the novels of Toni Morrison. I hope that you will do this for your own aesthetic and spiritual development, and I hope you will do this for the aesthetic and spiritual development of our nation. Thank you very much. So if we have any questions about anything I may have said, or if you have some questions about the novel, I'm happy to try my best to answer them. There may be some people here who are experts on Toni Morrison. Happy. I brought my little novel with me, so I have it right here. This is an old cover, so it's an older copy.
We'd love if a St. Mary's student would ask the first question.
So the characters in the book who have biblical names, you've talked a little bit about Pilate and the irony of her name and how she is kind of figuring that. But how about some of the other characters? How well do you feel like they relate with their biblical names?
How well do I think the last part, just again, last sentence, I'm sorry.
How well do you think their names fit? Do you think they bring like new meaning to them, or do you think the histories?
Well, they follow this this kind of tradition. So they have a tradition. You name the first girl by sticking or the girls, put your hand in the Bible, and whatever comes up, that's the name. So when Pilate gives birth to Reba, she's on the island, and she's living there with her common-law husband. And she asks, there's no Bible at hand, and she asks the women, do they know any good biblical names? And they say, oh, yes. And so they give her several, and she picks Rebecca, but she shortens it to Reba. And Rebecca has a very interesting, sort of life in the Bible, if you will, in the early books there. I mean, she's really connected with Jacob. And he has another wife. He has two of them. He loves Leah. I'm remembering this. This is a good point. I'm remembering that he loves Leah very much, but it's Rebecca that has the problem. And this Reba also has a problem. She also has a problem, and she has a problem with men. Hagar, that's a very interesting. Hagar is the person, of course, who was driven from Sarah and Abraham. And she's the first person, actually, in the Hebrew Bible, who names God. If you go to those verses in Genesis, because she says there, she's in the wilderness, pleading to die because she's been cast out, she has nothing. But she sees the angel of the Lord comes to her. And so she becomes this person who is seeing God. She says, you are a God of seeing. You saw me. I'm not so sure about Hagar. I think that's a kind of an accidental connection. But I think the making dead may seem humorous, but it represents the tragedy of the loss of African American names historically, because people cannot identify their names. Just one quick story. When there's a wonderful African theologian, Ebusi Bulaga, who visited Boston College. He's deceased now. He's a former Jesuit, and he came to give some lectures at Tufts and some other places. And the Jesuits who were studying wanted to meet with him, and so he came to meet with them. And the students invited another professor and myself. And so the really poignant thing that he said at that meeting, this is like maybe 2009, he says, there will be African names in the White House. It was a profoundly moving moment for me personally, to think about names and naming. And the dedication to this book is really, her epigraph, really, not her dedication is for her father. She writes this book after her father has died, and Morrison does. The epigraph says, the fathers may soar, and the children may know their names. So how do you know your name? Where does your name come from? So you're replacing the name of the slaveholder with another very artificially constructed name. So not someone who even has a plan, but someone who's drunk and thoughtless names someone. But the narrator in the book says that he's so stubborn he won't change his name. And so that name gets passed on to the eldest male child. Yeah. Lena in 1 Corinthians, are really, that's a good question to think more about. I'm compressing a lot, here, but yeah. 1 Corinthians is a helper. I mean, you get in 1 Corinthians, you get your list of all the people who are helping Paul. That's one of them. That's where some of these people appear. Yeah. Is that? I mean, that's the best I can do on the moment, but.
I've been thinking that's a very creative way of following an evolution of your ancestors, especially for the black culture. I taught in the middle of the the first riot in Watts in Los Angeles, totally black. And so many of them did not know they had no idea who their ancestors were. And they had no idea, some of them, who their parents were, how they were married, were they married, where did they come from? It seems to me, is there another author today that's sort of following that same pattern, archetype almost, that she used? Because she did bring in all these symbolisms that's so important in our life. And I thought, I was sort of fascinating watching it, or listening to it, and reflecting back my experiences in the middle of this culture at a very tumultuous time. I guess that's my question. Mm-hmm. Is there anyone today that's following in her footsteps?
Well, that's a very it's a very interesting question. Like the first one, it's also challenging. If you're thinking about people concerned with genealogy, there are autobiographical novels that are written that do some of that. I'm thinking of an old, somebody can help me, of an old novel. I think it's Black Ice, which is an autobiographical story of someone's life. I mean, there are any number of writers of various cultures who struggle with that, of course. The African American story is made more complex, not because it's so important or so special, but because it's representative in some ways of fears that we have about the other. And so if you think that this novel was written in 1977, well, we got to this, last year we got to 400 years for black people to be in the United States. And when you think about that, for 400 years not really knowing who you are, most people, it's actually very shattering. And so if people are fragmented, it's because they were intentionally fragmented. You know, we can think of, I can't think of a novelist. I mean, I'm thinking about, for myself for a minute, about Colson Whitehead, who just has done this novel on the Underground Railroad, but I haven't read it, so I can't really, he makes the cities up to date. I mean, he tries to think about it that way. But if somebody's reading this and has some insight into it, I'm happy to take your wisdom. But I can't really say. There are very good novelists writing, for sure. There's some very, very good novelists. But that's what I could really say about that, actually, quite honestly, you know, to answer the question. I think knowing where you're from is so crucial. And we don't know. You have glimmers, you have intimations, but you don't have any knowledge. It's not like, you know, landing in Dublin and heading off for, you know, County Clare and, you know, the old homestead, or meeting people in that way. It's just not like that. Do you have any insight here?
No.
No,
It's
okay.
no. I actually, in relationship to that, I think that it's a great question, because first of all, thank you. One of the things you didn't say that, you know, a simpleton like me would say is that, you know, Toni Morrison was in fact Catholic. She's a Catholic.
Yes, she is.
Yeah,
I didn't say that.
Yeah, yes. So, like, you know, she's a black Catholic, right? And we like to take credit.
Where we can get it.
Yeah, well, we can get it. That's right.
We also want Bill Gates' money now, too.
Yeah. But I thinking about this, I haven't read I'm going to read Song of Solomon because of what the things you just said, but of being a child who was raised in the older tradition, where my father who was moved to Chicago in the 50s, regularly took me. I spent the summers in Mississippi. Took me back and walked and drove through and said, he was born here, and your aunt was born there, and then went to the next town, and your other aunt and uncle were born here, and then we walked, and the plantation was here, and we had to call so and so Mister, even when he was first born.
Yes.
And so having a connection to my history in ways that many of my peers just didn't.
Yes. Yes.
Just
Yes.
didn't.
Yes.
And even though we couldn't trace the names of our ancestors back to the motherland, on some level, it seems to me that Morrison is saying, yes, but there is a new tradition that is being built by renaming and claiming that very particular history with, strangely enough, with the name dead.
Yes. Yes.
Strangely enough,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Yes.
A new history is a new line is being written.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And I'm grateful for her ingenuity to be able to say that, just because we cannot go back all the way, doesn't mean we can't have a history.
That's right. That's right. We have a past for sure, huh? We have a past. And let me criticize myself. I mean, in this way, that not all history needs to be written history. But we don't have in the modern Western world any sense of oral tradition much, even though there are cultures that revel in the oral, and we just really, it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. So yes, I think that's right. I think her ingenuity, her creativity is incredible, and yes, she was Catholic. She became Catholic about the age of 12 because she had a cousin whom she admired, and her cousin was Catholic, and she wanted to become Catholic, so she did. And she didn't, toward the end of, I forget the year now, I have it somewhere in the notes, but she gave a interview with Terry Gross not long after the Nobel Prize, in which she says to Terry Gross, yes, I'm Catholic, on National Public Radio. And she says to her, I'm very interested. I don't have much structured religion, she says, but I'm very interested in this new pope. I'm very interested in Francis, she says, which is a really kind of interesting thing. It's a really kind of interesting thing. So she's alert to what's happening. How could you not be? But she is. She is. And that's a very good thing. It's a very good thing for all of us. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, she was Catholic. And the other thing that Morrison does wonderfully is read slave narratives. So if you go to slave narratives, particularly Drums and Shadows, which is a collection from Georgia, there are people who will tell you the story of the flying Africans as if it happened yesterday because their grandfather saw it happen. It's very interesting. And Morrison says in one interview, well, I always grew up believing that African Americans could fly. So I thought Africans could fly. I thought we could fly. She says, people told me that. So yeah, you may think it's silly, she says, but I think people can fly. It's a quite marvelous sort of, I love it personally. I mean, I love it. I love it. The other thing that's a beautiful last line in the novel, one of the last lines, is where Milkman decides that Pilate is the only person who can fly without ever leaving the ground. I mean, it's an offset on the metaphor of actually doing it, but it doesn't take away from the possibilities of it. So, yes, what sort of a novel is this? I mean, it's a very strange novel in many ways. The characters are, in some ways, very strange characters. But it also, this point about people not being aware of their history, what happens to you when you are unaware of your history, your past, your family, your life. When you're unaware, very bad things can happen to you. You can misunderstand yourself. You can mistake yourself. And this is what your father was trying to, he was telling you where your roots, it's reconfiguring the search for roots. It's reconfiguring the Great Migration. It's reinscribing the movement of the Great Migration, because that's what's happening. And what's interesting with this novel is that actually Milkman goes south to understand who he is. All the narratives are going north. Like I can't find the town. I have pored over places in Michigan. I'm from Michigan. And I'm looking to see where could you fly over Lake Superior, because that's the lake he wants to fly over, to the other side. Well, if you look at Lake Superior on, I don't think you can see it on the map. I don't think you can actually. Well, maybe we can. Wait. Yeah, Lake Superior is there by the red line at the top here. I don't think this says it. Okay, so there it is. And what's beyond Lake Superior, the other side of Lake Superior, is Canada. This is your North Star movement. This is your movement to freedom. Although we found out, of course, that there was slavery in Canada, and very bad things did happen to black people in Canada. Yes, the myth. Oh, there's the mythos. Absolutely, absolutely. And it's encouraging. It's encouraging. Frederick Douglass names his newspaper the North Star. You follow the North Star. If you've seen Harriet, whatever you think, it doesn't matter. It's a great film. And I'm saying that to myself too, because the argument about African Americans not being able to represent their own, characters is really a hard thing, because we don't need to have one-to-one representation in Hollywood or any other place. But I get it. She's excellent, though. And when the minister tells her, here you go, follow the North Star, she gets it. She gets it because she's at home in nature to some extent. She gets it, and she does it. And it's a great evocation of that woman's life. I mean, it's tremendous. It's really tremendous. People never heard of Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, he's up and coming all the time lately, but yeah. Yeah, the North Star. He's trying to get to freedom. He's trying to escape segregation. And this man's death, Mr. Robert Smith, North Carolina Mutual Insurance was a black insurance agency. Black people had to have some way of being buried, because you're not just going to go to any funeral director, because nobody wants your body. We have black cemeteries, so even in the North, segregated cemeteries. Maybe not here in Indiana. I don't really know your history. But certainly in Michigan we did. So you're really, she's got so much packed in here. So much packed in here. You just have to keep reading and reading and reading her to just start peeling back layers. There's stuff there. So, way in the back there? Way in the back? Oh, you're just waving. Okay, all right. Well, while you're going, there's a question right here.
I just have a very simple question. My question is so simple. Thank you for this exciting talk. Did I steal somebody's turn?
It's okay. We have to get the microphone back there, so I just gave Emily a chance to move more slowly.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your lecture. I think it's very important to see Toni Morrison in her Christian spirituality, because the only novel of Toni Morrison I read is The Beloved.
Beloved, yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
And then even just the title, that just evokes the Song of Solomon right away, right? And then also why Song of Solomon? I mean, this is most enigmatic and then very sensual and the problematic book in the Bible, right?
Yes.
And then she also the characters, and then also who is she actually beloved? Is she a ghost? And that's exactly what's going on also in Song of Solomon too, right? And then I just was, and then later on I came to know that she actually wrote a novel which is also Song of Solomon. And why? Why is she so fascinated by Song of Solomon? And you see really everywhere in her novels the strong impact of Song of Solomon. And then also, I noticed in there is a scene in The Beloved, the girl who couldn't read, and then she actually learned to write the copying Bible word by word. So Bible is so indebted in their entire like spiritual like education. And then I think she picked at it too. And then everywhere, I mean, you see a lot of references to the Bible. So I think, going back to my question, why Song of Solomon was so important for her, and then how much you see Song of Solomon everywhere in her literature. So,
Well, this theme of love, is really an important one. And love goes awry in Beloved in some ways. I mean, there's a love that turns into hideous. It's not really love, it's just lust. That can be mistaken by some people for love, but it's just lust. And some of it is just sadistic lust. But there's also there love gone awry, loving so deeply. But I'm changing my mind on that. My first reading of Beloved was really that it ended, well, that Baby Suggs was, a heroic figure, and she kept us all together to the end. But I think in some ways that's a bigger burden on Baby Suggs than needs to be. I don't think, my second reading, or my third or fourth, is really that I'm not sure about that, and so I'm much more willing to say that when she lies down and turns her face to the wall, she gives up. She really is overcome by the death of this child. So there's a lot there. But this is a novel also about love, and love in this novel sometimes goes awry. Milkman has no real sense about how to treat women. He's just a play guy. He doesn't really care about his sisters. He doesn't care really about his mother, except that what she does for him. He uses Hagar sexually, and he is alternately, as a young man, indifferent and oblivious to Pilate, but it's Pilate who gives him his life. If he had not gone on the quest to look for the gold, he would not have found out who he is. And it's her doing, because she has these bones and rocks. I mean, there's a lot there. I mean, there's so much there. There's so much there. You can only take a few things, really. But I think in as much as the Song of Solomon, yes, it's a beautifully erotic poem, and it's also about love. But love can also go awry. Love can also go awry. So loving the ancestors becomes really important, keeping their memory alive, sealing those names on your heart. I mean, that's her challenge. The fathers may soar, the children may know their names. And the children have children. That's the point. This is ancestral. It doesn't stop at one little place. It just keeps on going on to other generations. So there has to be some way that we learn those names. I mean, people like Eric Stiles' parents have taken over the South as their homeland. And so that's why your migration comes back. I guess they're going to do a comeback on Roots for Black History Month. And so we're going to see, Lamar Burton doing Kunta Kinte. But the horrible part of that is it's true to lose your name. He refuses to submit to someone calling him by what is not his name. And the old African-American experience, don't call me out of my name. I mean, this is a heavily cultural novel. And if you've only thought of black culture as pathological, then you've really missed out on something important. There are a lot of subtleties here that black people don't all master. I mean, mastering your culture, really appropriating it fully and is really a lifetime project. Few people are really able to do this. This is why novelists are so important, so important. Because she has the time and the inclination and the talent to really coach us, coax us, teach us, lift us up, give us a different kind of experience, That's a very thoughtful comment. I mean, it's very evocative in this way. I mean, he loves freedom, but he leaves his family. He loves them. Whether they had 21 children or not, it's impossible to think. Some of that must be legend. But they had some children. And he left everyone. And yes, what happens when we leave people? Rena goes insane. Hagar will go insane when Milkman discards her. So in this sense, is it stay home and be, like Macon did, become indifferent to your family? What is it? I don't know. We're looking for a happy medium somewhere. I mean, so if you take some novel like this, maybe, I don't know, in concert with something like, Things Fall Apart, Chinua Achebe, or I mean, there's so many things. I mean, you can, or even Wizard of the Crow, which is by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. It's really there are a lot of different ways in which you can begin to intersect how novelists all work, the same but not the same. They're all thinking and researching and writing and rewriting and talking and paying attention to the world, which is a good challenge for us as theologians, to keep thinking and rewriting and thinking and watching and attending to the world, because it's God's world and it's a holy place. Even when we're furious at it, it's a holy place, Just this right here, and we'll finish up with this last. Okay, all right, well, this last point, one last point. Yeah, that's a book worth writing. That's a book worth writing. What would I what? I don't know. I don't know, because the older you get, the more you realize that you can't write to your title. You can't write to your title. You start with, everybody wants your title and your abstract before you've written your talk, But yeah, but that's something to think about. It's something to think about. Anyway, yeah.
Please join me in thanking Professor Copeland.
Thank you.